armies, battalions that have no idea that they've already enlisted in the cause. Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere.
I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to watch Andor. I did a video about Star Wars before, kind of a structural examination of Disney-era Star Wars, only briefly on the individual products and more focused on what Disney's goals and processes are and how that creates Star Wars that sucks mostly and will probably keep sucking, but I tried to end that video on a positive note. They'll probably make good Star Wars at some point, if only by accident, because the power and potential of Star Wars draws creative people to it. I thought that was a better ending than saying, all Star Wars is shit now, forever, like I'd be boycotting it or something. A, that would be stupid, and B, obviously I am going to come back to Star Wars eventually. It's Star Wars, so acting like I won't just sets me up to look stupid. But a funny thing happened. Spending all that time going back over those movies and shows and writing about them, actually that gave me a feeling of closure about what all of these products were going to look like, and that closure gave me space to think, okay, Star Wars is bad now, and let it lie. I said I'd come back for a show if people I respected said it was good, but then the moment came and they said it was good, and the truth is I didn't want to. And this is a very stupid way to talk about goddamn Star Wars, and I was working on a script about Twilight and 50 Shades and romance fiction and fan fiction as spaces for women and queer people, and I have properly elitist stuff in my backlog like defending Don't Worry Darling and criticizing The Fast and the Furious, and there's enough nerd channels on the internet that just talk about Star Wars. But it was early January of a long holiday season, and it had been dark and rainy for more than a month, and I felt like making some bad decisions. So I watched Andor. And hang on, was Andor good? Like a Star Wars thing that's worth talking about as a piece of art and broadly successful on those terms? Like a surprisingly sophisticated commentary on authoritarianism and totalitarianism? That can't be right. Star Wars? So here we are. Anyway, instead of talking about Andor, let's go back and talk for a bit about Rogue One. And if you did watch that last video, yes, I talked about Rogue One before, but I think it's worth going into more detail about, since Andor's showrunner, Tony Gilroy, was the main writer of Rogue One, as well as the director of extensive reshoots that seem to have been intended to bring the movie back toward his vision. And yeah, production on Rogue One, like production on most Star Wars productions since Disney acquired the company, was kind of a mess, which makes it hard to be conclusive about tracing anything from Rogue One to Andor. What we can say based on reports is that Gilroy is responsible for the final script of Rogue One and its final cut, and in particular seems to have come back and crafted its ending, which one assumes means Rogue One's ludicrously powerful last act, as well as, well, that very last sequence. And the problems with Rogue One are real. It is a structural mess, where it's not really clear what the movie's story even is until the last act. The characters' arcs are a problem. The movie sort of sets up what the arcs are going to be and then acts like it's done the arcs when it's time to pay them off, but without any actual arcs in between. And the characters are all presented as so ludicrously hyper-competent that it's tough to give them any challenges that actually matter. It has one of the worst scenes in a franchise that has a lot of bad scenes, and it's tempting to look at all that and go, maybe all that stuff was introduced in the production chaos, and maybe. But remember that Tony Gilroy also wrote most of the Bourne movies. Anyway, Rogue One has two great strengths. Two things it did better than any other Disney-era Star Wars production. The first is that Rogue One Star Wars is the only Disney Star Wars movie that really, really looks like you imagined Star Wars would look like when you were a kid. Not, here's the Millennium Falcon. Not, let's show you where Luke grew up so you can cheer. When you were a kid and you saw Star Wars for the first time, didn't you imagine that you were seeing corners of a galaxy that these scenes evoked? That's what Rogue One looks like. Everything looks like it came from the same galaxy that would also have Tatooine and Hoth. Even Jedha, which is really just yet another Star Wars desert planet, is a Star Wars desert planet so much that it's possible to forget that however much you imagined Mos Eisley or wherever before, you really never saw this before. Its greatest sin is that it looks so right, you're going, yeah, sure, I've seen that before, even though you really haven't. And all those times we went back, in The Rise of Skywalker and The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi, it always had the callbacks, but it never once looked as much like Star Wars as Rogue One's Jedha. And the same is true of Andor. Every one of these planets, every one of these settings just looks like Star Wars. There's an incredible amount of great set design, costuming, production design. It all fits seamlessly into the Star Wars aesthetic. I'm not going to focus on it, but I wanted to acknowledge it. Except I will say for one thing, for some reason, Andor's galaxy is very human. Honestly, I'm surprised there are so few aliens here. In such a great opportunity to make it seem like this galaxy might have 10,000 sapient species. Second, Gilroy understands the symbols and is leveraging them deliberately. Star Wars has always been an elemental story, literally a war between good and evil, fought between the guys with the blue swords and the guys with the red swords. And one of its strengths, at its best, has always been the way that the design of the world flows out of that. This, and what it's possible to do with that, are going to be most of the rest of this video. In Rogue One, Gilroy took those pieces and arranged them in a powerful and careful argument about the rebellion, which is to say, what Rogue One's empire really is, how it wins, is fear and distrust. It infects you with fear and distrust until you're just barely hanging on and you can't take a risk. And while the movie frequently describes the way you fight back against that as hope, what it seems to mean by that is probably something nearer to fellowship, or even solidarity. Everyone in the rebellion, from the Imperial weapons designer to the reprogrammed droid to the girl that just showed up and doesn't seem to want to be here, they all have some reason to not trust each other. The rebellion as the movie starts is in a state of crisis, not because it has no ships, not because it's overmatched. It is, but they're in crisis because they're scared, and they don't trust each other, and they're trying to figure every angle, and they don't dare to hope. And so, yes, this, my least favorite scene in Star Wars, is Rogue One's most important, because it's the fundamental thematic statement of the movie, the thing that the entire third act will end up enacting. That rebellion, that opposition to evil, is fundamentally about believing in, relying on, the opportunity for redemption, not just for yourself, but also for others. In A New Hope, a small group of scrappy rebels defeat the Death Star by finding a tiny weak spot. Rogue One builds that out. Luke Skywalker's shot down the exhaust port is an act of resistance. Han Solo shooting Darth Vader to get him off of Luke's back is an act of resistance. When John Vander, Dex Tyree, Davish Krail, Garvin Dries, Theron Nett, and Puck Nako, yes, I looked those names up, made their trench runs on the Death Star, those were acts of resistance. Bringing Leia and the Death Star plans to the Rebel Alliance, fleeing Scarif with the Death Star plans, transmitting the Death Star plans to the Rebel fleet, and building a secret weakness into the Death Star. Every one of these is an act of resistance and solidarity. Luke doesn't destroy the Death Star. 10,000 acts of resistance do. It is a thing we do together, and resistance becomes redemptive. It wipes the slate. Not the moral slate, but our slate with each other. And fair warning, if you think I'm being self-serious about some campy nerd shit, we're not finished. This isn't a general review, and I'm not going to try to balance positive stuff against negative stuff. I hope it's understood that everything that comes is coming from a place of respect, that I think highly of Andor, and I'm willing to give it this level of attention. So, Andor is on its strongest footing talking about authoritarianism. That's kind of interesting on its own. Andor is kind of rehashing Rogue One, but given more space to talk, it's much better at talking about the Empire than the Rebellion, though we'll get there too. I think a lot of commentary is focused on specific points, but what's so striking about Andor is its sense of the tentacles of repression, of how oppression fits into, emerges from, and reshapes all sorts of social practices and institutions. Wars? The easiest place to start is the Empire's hatred of cultural difference. Star Wars has actually struggled with this historically. We've gotten some general claims about Imperial racial supremacy and the multicultural rebellion. We've gotten imagery that indicates that the Empire wants everyone to look and speak the same, but it's tough. We notice cultural practices when they're distinct from our own, and the more alien your characters seem, the less automatically the audience reads them as sympathetic. So the more actually diverse the rebellion is, the more work has to go into building sympathy for them. But in Andor, the Kenari have a culture, Ferrix has a culture, Aldhani has a culture, Chandrila has a culture, Luthen is doing a cultural performance, even Coruscant to a limited extent has a culture. There are missteps. The Aldhani Highlanders, for all that they have a couple funny bits, are a real low point. Actually, none of these are great. Brutalism is wrong for Coruscant. It makes this place seem eternally miserable. This planet city in decline should have abandoned playgrounds and parks filled over with gravel and shuttered elementary schools, teenage delinquents made to clean graffiti under the watchful eye of Imperial security officers. Not this empty nothing. The Chandrilan cultural practices are presented with such hostility that it's difficult to accept that anyone finds them appealing. There's a lot of weakness with basic setup and payoff. The story, with a whole season to work with, just introduces pieces of culture a couple of minutes before it intends to use them, and that's kind of a mess. But put all of that aside, what's important is that cultural variety is something for the Empire to put its jackboot on. The Empire despises expressions of culture. It gives senators luxurious homes, but won't let them decorate for fear of expressions of different culture. Indeed, cultural practices become the weapons of resistance. Every culture I just mentioned is weaponized by the rebellion against the Empire, and every time it is the Empire's disrespect for that culture that leaves it vulnerable to attack. Personally, I love Luthen's cover as an antiquities dealer. The Empire would recognize that profession, find it harmless, raiding dying cultures for the tchotchkes to sell to the Imperial aristocracy. And yet, at the same time, Luthen is assembling tiny pieces of the strength of 1,000 different peoples to strike together against the Empire. And of course, the Empire has culture too. You don't get these hilarious riding breaches without a culture. It just can't recognize its own practices as cultural. This is all part and parcel of a simultaneous argument about the Empire's relationship to political and social institutions, to prisons, to banking and finances, to the Senate, and to corporations. We already know what's going to happen to the Galactic Senate and how it gets there. Now we see the Senate in a middle ground between collapse and dissolution. It's an institution whose existence legitimizes the ruling power. For as long as the ruling power finds that legitimacy useful, it is permitted to continue as a rump legislature, where the least troublesome members of the opposition can make token complaints that only make them seem even more ineffectual. Between the Senate as decadent and unresponsive and easily co-opted, and the Senate being simply dissolved, the Senate is systematized, denied any independent authority, regularized as an instrument of imperial power. I'm talking about this for 3 reasons. First, this isn't really some storytelling construct imagined of a galaxy far, far away. Electoral autocracy, the form of government in which a legislature and elections exist because they manufacture legitimacy for the regime, but the regime keeps power by putting its thumb on the scale, rejecting opposition parties, arresting opposition leaders, suppressing the press, assuming emergency powers, and so on. This form of government is the most common in the world today, the one most people live under. This is where Andor is on, by far, its most empirically solid ground. Second, this is all in the same territory as what George Lucas hoped to say, back when he resurrected a story he told 20 years earlier so he could talk about a grand ancient federation grown so decadent that it can't prevent its own merchant cartel from blockading even invading one of its member states, its chancellor having to turn to some weird religious order because the instruments of state are so stagnant that bypassing them is the only way to exert any authority. To note that this decadent state's inability to handle its problems creates the opportunity for autocratic opportunists to create and leverage full-blown crisis. It's much more well told here than there, but this is all very much in Star Wars' blood. And third, for Andor, this is not just the Senate. This is how the Empire treats institutions. First they get co-opted, then they get regularized, then they get supplanted. This is how the Empire treats Preox Morlana, the corporation that runs Ferrix and Morlana 1. The corporation is only too happy to operate under the Empire. The Empire is all guaranteed contracts and no competition. But with the Empire comes the expectation that Pre-Mor will operate smoothly as a cog in the Imperial machine. When that cog eventually kicks, well, then the Empire will do what it does when a cog kicks. Demolish the whole thing and replace it with something more fit for purpose. Say, the Imperial Security Bureau. This is a great machine of homogenization. Just as all culture is destroyed except one stagnant set of practices, all institutions become one institution, one security bureau. And since its primary function is to make sure everyone behaves as expected, a single hammer for every nail, the whole galaxy becomes an apparatus for preserving and reifying the hierarchy of power, like one big prison. I promise we'll come back to that. First, possibly the most interesting touch in Andor's thematic arguments is actually this one. This ship, the one Andor, at this point, Casa, finds himself on, this ship isn't Imperial. This ship is Republic. It's the Republic that strip mines Kenari, Republic soldiers that kill the leader of his semi-nomadic band, Republic soldiers who, Marva Andor knows, are going to come and punish 9-year-old Casa for being in the vicinity of the steady Republic advancement into whatever spaces it finds valuable. However democratic or undemocratic the Republic is, the Kenari are not enfranchised, so they're in the way. The state ignores them until they become an obstacle, and then they're held responsible for violating some law or some contract worked out in a forum they had limited, if any, access to. They become a whole culture of malcontents, and it becomes the state's job to forcibly bring them into compliance. And if they resist that, then they're just criminals, and the state's job is to use whatever force is necessary to apprehend them. All of which is to say, colonialism is a sort of proto-totalitarianism. While the transition from Republic to Empire disenfranchised people like Marva, Luthen, and Mon, this behavior was always to some extent a part of the system. It's no surprise many of the institutions of the Republic are comfortable with the first parts of the shift to a totalitarian state, first intact, then suborned, then transformed, and maybe only years or decades later eventually obliterated. Let's take a break and talk about some beats I think were missed. One of the things that Andor briefly touches on that I wish were more present in Star Wars is the Emperor as a retreating figure. In the original trilogy, and to some extent the prequels, the dark side of the Force is about projecting your ego onto the world, dominating it, a desire motivated by fear or anger or something like that, while the light side is about preserving harmony between yourself and your environment, moving through it smoothly. And yet the dark side as a mechanism for gaining power is useless. That power is destructive, but it's also hollow. The Emperor wants to impose his ego on the whole galaxy, but for all the destruction he causes, it's all futile. All that subservience is just to build a world where nothing touches him. All his work is done through fewer and fewer intermediaries, who are allowed fewer and fewer audiences, where he directs them to stamp out the little resistance that's the only reason he still meets with anybody. Palpatine sits alone in his private chambers, surrounded by his unmoving, silent guards. The most important, most powerful person in the whole galaxy, living that Obi-Wan Kenobi cave life. Obviously, Andor's not a Palpatine biopic, and he's had plenty of screen time already, but with Andor's great sense of why this world has thematic, symbolic power, I'd like to have seen a little more emphasis on this thing that is there in the background. how while the ability to say the Emperor has decreed or the Emperor has instructed me carries authority for Imperial functionaries, the mechanisms of galactic oppression are not Palpatine. He directed their creation, but they are intentional, regularized processes that run without him. More importantly, Andor actually kind of struggles to depict the rebellion. We get a rough sense of a few of its key players, parts of its organization, and some of its operations, but key things are missing. We have no clear sense of the rebellion's size, which makes sense if this story is from Cassian Andor's perspective, since he wouldn't know, but it's a storytelling challenge if you're trying to tell the story of the rebellion in parallel to that. We also don't have a strong sense of their motivations. At best, the rebels are sharply divided. There's the people on the ground who mostly have sympathetic motivations, survival, maybe a little bit adventure, maybe a little bit money, maybe if they're lucky a little bit of a chance at building a future with a bit of enfranchisement. On the other hand, you have people like Mon Mothma, and what does Mon Mothma think is the end goal here? The Republic of a couple of years earlier, but with her or someone like her as Chancellor? You can see how that's unsympathetic in more than one way. And that's all informed by, what's the rebellion's strategy? In A New Hope, we immediately understand the rebellion. It's a structured military force fighting a civil war. They're losing it, but we know what they are and what they're doing. Their goals, their equipment, their bases, all of this makes sense for that group, and Rogue One fits that. But in Andor, I don't really know. Well, I kinda know. But I'm skeptical about whether it's deliberate. So, the show is kind of the story of it becoming the force we do see in Rogue One and A New Hope, right? So, the Rebellion is a small, quasi-secret, identified faction, primarily of wealthy, educated, but politically excluded members of the upper classes, whose goal is to use targeted action to mobilize dissent, gain resources, and particularly to provoke the kind of violent overreach that drives mass dissatisfaction on behalf of the disenfranchised and so far unmobilized lower classes in hopes of creating in those classes a broad-based uprising. And that's a Leninist vanguard party. Like, that's what that is. Given the choice between Tony Gilroy is a secret tanky smuggling a Marxist-Leninist tract into Star Wars under everyone's noses, and this is an unfortunate accident of wrangling the total disaster that is the canon between episodes 3 and 4, I'm pretty sure it's the latter. But, Anyway, in that vein, two more thoughts. First, the show wants to have its cynicism and its idealism in the same breath on the same subjects. Like, why does Ferrix rebel? Ferrix hasn't seen most of the oppression or paranoia that we witnessed in the show. The argument for its rebellion is that the Empire committed a series of encroachments and blunders driven by cultural insensitivity and an obsessive need to control every situation, and these created dissent that then erupted. I like that argument as far as it goes. But every other piece of storytelling we've had has all said that the citizenry at all levels broadly accepts or forgets those encroachments, those slow additional tyrannies. Second, the show is missing the legacy of separatism that ought to color everyone's beliefs and rhetoric. Everyone who stands by the Empire should be talking about this huge civil war that happened in their lifetimes, and how the Republic didn't stop it. Everyone who stands by the rebellion should have some relationship toward separatism, whether they were separatists, or they thought the Republic came down too hard on separatists, or they're trying to draw a line between what they're doing and separatism. Imperial rhetoric about rebels should be all about how they're trying to start the Civil War over again. When Mon Mothma chides her friends for saying they feel unsafe, they might well point out that Coruscant was the center of multiple terrorist attacks and at least one all-out battle. It's not that we should have some special loyalty to that lore, or be trying to get those references in, but a grounding in a lived history makes all this credible. This dude must have worked for Republic intelligence before the transition to Empire. So what was that transition like? Did he scrape to hold his position, or did he rise rapidly because he fit into the Imperial way of doing things? Who are these senators leaving in this scene? Were they in the Senate during the Republic's fall and they've just given up? Are they Imperial lackeys given patronage appointments? Or has the Senate turned into a political backwater that politicians are sent to be kept out of the way? These things don't need to be storylines. But mentioning these kinds of things would make the world seem more real and inform the overall argument of the show. And while I'm complaining, the show's too long. Obviously you can't play with a show's runtime to the extent you can in movies, but there's not enough stuff here. A lot of editing down to improve pacing is trimming individual lines and individual seconds, and Andor could use that. A lot of scenes drag on, don't go anywhere, or just repeat previous scenes. But there's also tons of scenes that could be removed. Mon Mothma's story is doing thematic work, and her character presumably needs to be introduced for next season, but this should be 3 or 4 scenes, not a major subplot. We could cut this twist linking Vel Sartha and Mon Mothma, which just makes the rebellion feel like this is a friend group of half a dozen people, like this is Les Mis, and they all hang out at the same cafe. The dynamic between Luthen and his associate, Kreia, is fun, but there's way too much of this standing around and whining. The whole thing with Saw Gerrera could be around 2 short scenes, and without this whole mess, I hope this scene is establishing something about Luthen's ship for next season, because otherwise I have no idea what it's for. Cassian's interest in his lost sister doesn't connect to anything else in the story. This scene where Cyril and Dedra meet takes a poorly considered argument the show is making about men turning to authoritarianism because they feel emasculated by their mothers, and escalates it to absurd proportions, and it makes both these characters look silly right at the moment the story would like them to be scary, and it isn't actually necessary for establishing the characters' motivations or getting them into position. And there's about an entire episode too much of the prison arc, which ends up riding the masterful execution of its ending sequence to escape just how wasteful and redundant the storytelling up to that point had been. The kind of overly leisurely pacing that gives you time to start asking, like, did they really think the galaxy was going to be really upset about the prison sentence durations of some guys at an isolated prison labor camp? Let's wrap up with a limited defense of that post-credits scene. Now, there is something wrong with this scene, but it's not that it's empty fan service. It's that it doesn't belong in the credits. This isn't some disconnected lore-advancing thing to build hype for the next project. This is the capstone of the whole thematic argument. It's just the last scene of the story. Like I said back when we started, Gilroy understands the symbols here, understands how the images assemble to make an argument. Way back in Rogue One, the ending scene was the rebellion encountering Darth Vader, defeating Darth Vader. Though we're bad enough socially at media literacy that I don't think many people got that. The mission was to transmit the Death Star plans, and the Death Star plans were transmitted. And all of Darth Vader's fancy, scary lightsaber moves didn't stop that. He killed a bunch of rebels, but they had a trump card over his ability to kill them. And that trump card was faith or solidarity. All they had to do was trust each other, be willing to sacrifice themselves just to get that message one person down the line, because the Death Star plans aren't really the technical specifications of a superweapon, they are a message of hope. The Death Star represents the culmination of Palpatine's plan to gain ultimate power. It represents the fundamental assertion of totalitarian power. It is an instrument for administering arbitrary punishment to anybody, anywhere, at any time. Here are the prison guards, and here are the prisoners, and if they don't assume the position on demand, the guards just administer an arbitrary punishment and move on. Andor has a keen sense of how the encroaching hand of the authoritarian will first reach the disenfranchised, like, say, the semi-nomadic tribe, or the prisoners. Nobody even knows what they were convicted for, or cares, and due process has long since been abandoned, so really, saying they were convicted of a crime is a legacy of a time when these institutions were used for that purpose. And the Empire extending their sentences and further suspending judicial processes wasn't a secret, it just flitted through the story without anyone much noticing. But totalitarianism ultimately imprisons everybody. It asserts authority to deny their ability to move about, to worship or practice their culture, to control their communication, both what they can say and what they can hear, to control their labor and their finances, to eliminate privacy and implement total surveillance, to respond to protests with absolute force, to further restrict their liberties without notice or process, and, of course, to regularize the use of those powers as a way of enforcing a regimented hierarchy. These are the characteristics of a prison. So every one of these guys who threw off their prison are rebels. Many, maybe most of them, committed crimes. Most of them only rebelled when they realized they had nothing to lose. And even so, it might be the truest form of rebellion. Hey, over the past couple of videos, some of you have been letting me know in the comments and through other channels you really like these and you wish they reached more people. As you already know, it does help with that if you like and subscribe. And of course, I appreciate comments. I love to see other people contributing to the discussion, trying to engage with media, and I also love unfettered praise, so either of those is good. Or share this directly with a friend or a community that you think would appreciate it. Either way, it's been really validating to have your support so far, and thanks.